Hello, I'm Bruce Adolphe, and this is Living the Classical Life.
Bruce Adolphe, we are so happy to have you here on Living the Classical Life. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
You're a musician of unusually diverse activities and pursuits. You're a composer, you're an author, you're a lecturer, you've written several books, and you're a pianist. I first came to know your work through American Public Media's performance today and The Piano Puzzler, which is very popular. For those who don't know what that is, what is The Piano Puzzler?
The Piano Puzzler is a kind of a game show, and I play well-known tunes, familiar tunes. They could be folk melodies, show tunes, Beatles songs, Cole Porter, Gershwin. Not anything terribly recent because of mostly copyright issues. And I play them in the styles of just about any classical composer you can think of, ranging from Bach and Beethoven and Brahms to Janacek and Dvorak and Chopin and Liszt and anybody. And people call in and they try to guess what is the tune and what is the composer's style. But more than that, sometimes it's an actual piece by, let's say, a piece by Brahms and a song from the Beatles that fit together. So they have to say, if they say Brahms, they're close, but they could even say, what Brahms is that? Because I weave things together that are very specific. It's kind of subversive education for people to use their brains and get inside the music. And we've been doing this now since 2002 every week.
Because it in fact concerns a little bit about each style that you've assimilated.
Well, people, if they guess right away, they say, oh, that's Brahms, then the show is not as interesting as if they think, well, it sounds 19th century, maybe it's romantic. We start talking about romanticism. I might demonstrate something. Somebody might guess that it's Schumann, which would be great, and then we could talk about why it sounds like Schumann, but it's not quite, and then we discuss Brahms when the person guesses it. And we might do the same thing with the popular melody too, depending how it fits in.
And of course, the Piano Puzzler is just a game, but in fact, a lot of your compositions have themes of the brain, memory, and neuroscience. At what point did you realize that music can invite an audience to think?
That is a great question. I think I could also ask myself at what point did I realize that I had already been thinking that for a long time? But I met Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist, in 1993 at a conference in the Aspen Institute, which was called Higher Brain Function. It was about creativity. And I was asked to speak about musical creativity, but it was a little bit shocking to be asked in 1993 because I wasn't known yet. I just started at Lincoln Center. I hadn't given the lectures that I was well known for later. So why they asked me was that there had been an article in the New York Times, Seen Any Mozarts Lately, which was an article about the hundreds of composers living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But I got the big photograph because I have a parrot, this bird that sings opera and jazz, and he was sitting on my knee with his mouth open. So there was a huge photograph on the cover of the Arts and Leisure section of me and my parrot. So people were calling me both from the music world and the parrot world. I was getting all kinds of calls from pet shops.
I believe his name is Polyrhythm.
Polyrhythm, exactly. So I got a call from a chemist named Carl Feniger in Aspen, running the Aspen Institute session that I was invited to do. And I had just written a little book called The Mind's Ear, which was musical games that encourage the imagination and sort of stimulate interesting ways of thinking about performing and composing and also listening, which I've rewritten since then. But he had seen the book called The Mind's Ear, and he said, so certainly you could talk at a science conference. I said, well, the book has nothing to do with science. He said, I didn't read it. That doesn't matter. The title, The Mind's Ear, is perfect. So I agreed to go, and I put together a talk about improvisation and versus composing, about making decisions and how creativity works. But it was a 4-day conference. And because I was going to play the piano, I was scheduled to be the last of 4 days worth of speakers, which was a little intimidating. And there were a lot of famous people there, a lot of great scientists. Very few people from the arts, but a lot of great scientists. And Antonio Damasio, who's a very famous neuroscientist now, was not as well known then because he hadn't published his first book, which is Descartes' Error. So he gave a talk based on Descartes' Error, which is a landmark science book discussing basically the idea that in neuroscience he had shown that you can't separate reason from emotion in the human mind. And he proved it, and a lot of people have been arguing about that for a long time, but he said you can't make a basic decision without an emotional context. So I was hearing his talk. He talked for about an hour, and I was just knocked out by how many amazing emotional and intellectual and creative ideas he had that could impact my own talk, which was the next day. So I took notes on this, and I went home, or I didn't go home, I went to the hotel, and I wrote a lot of reactions to Damasio's, I call him Antonio now, his lecture. And the next day I included a lot of conjecture about science and how it relates to musical creativity and theater and improvisation. And when it was over, there was a reception, and Antonio came up to me and said, "When did you write that, last night?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Because the ideas you're talking about from my talk have not been published yet, so it had to be last night." I said, "It was." And he said, "What's your science background?" I said, "This conference is my science background." And he liked that, so we became friendly, and then he and I occasionally would work on a project. Mostly they came from me originally because he was doing serious science, and I would call up and say, "I want to write a piece of music about one of your ideas," and I would discuss it with him. And it was through Antonio, to get back to your question, and through this neuroscience and the arts conference that I started to realize that there were scientific aspects to creativity and to music that are on the cutting edge of where we are with brain research and what the arts can do and what creativity is, which is a very hot topic. And many books on neuroscience and the brain have come out in the last 10 years, all sort of feeling their way a little tentatively. So I started writing pieces that addressed some of those issues of thinking and creativity in a musical way. One for Yo-Yo Ma, which was the actually culminating one, because I wrote 3 before that based on things Antonio had written. But then I called Antonio and said, "Let's work together this time. Instead of my taking published works of yours, can you write something for me to react to musically?" And he did. And he wrote essentially a kind of poetic meditation on the nature and the evolution of a brain into a mind, from an organ into an abstract thinking machine. I hate to use the word machine, he wouldn't like that. Still an organism. And it's very poetic, and I took it just as it was, but I didn't set it, and I didn't set it for a singer. I used it as a framework to both inspire some musical ideas, but also to actually find parallels between what music can do and what he was saying. So synapses firing and connections being made and things evolving slowly and blooming. He used the word bloom. So I tried to parallel both the poetic aspects of it and some of the scientific aspects of it. And then Antonio said, "Who is a great musician that we can get to do?" I hadn't even chosen instruments yet. We're just talking concepts. He said, "Let's have a great musician play the brain, so to speak." And so I started naming people, and it became clear he meant also famous.
Yes,
I said, "Okay, well, that narrows it down." So I said, "How's Yo-Yo Ma if he wants to do it?" He said, "That would be perfect." So, of course, the cello is perfect. And Yo-Yo and I are the same age. We've known each other since we were 16.
Oh, you did.
The first cello piece I ever wrote, I didn't write it for Yo-Yo, but he played it. And so I called him up, and I asked him, "Do you want to get involved in a project that has to do with neuroscience and it's based on Antonio Damasio's work?" And I wasn't surprised, but he immediately said, "Damasio, I love his books. I buy them, I give them as presents," because he's an intellectual guy, and I knew he'd be reading his stuff.
These.
He knew it very well, and he jumped right on it. And he immediately said, "I don't want it to be for piano, cello and piano. I want it to be something unusual." And we ended up with percussionists and lots of instruments with two players, because he didn't want it to seem like a recital piece. He wanted it to have something where the concept of the piece was related to the instruments in a way that was not just logistically or convenient. So it was a very inconvenient piece. A lot of instruments, and a lot of people have to play. Two people have to play a lot of instruments, and that's where that started.
So Bruce, take me back to the beginning. You grew up on Long Island. What was your first musical impulse? Was there music in your home?
There was music in my home. My parents were not musicians, but they were really good dancers. And I don't mean social dancing. They were serious about folk dance. And during the summers, they taught folk dance, not during the year. They were both teachers, but and not of music. My father taught English, and my mother had taught a number of things. And when I was growing up, she was teaching gym. And both in public schools. And during the summers, though, they taught folk dancing, and they knew every folk dance, it seemed to me, from around the world. And they had a huge collection of 45 records that represented folk music from really everywhere. And they could just go in and out of almost every country, that at least it seemed that way to a child, but it was a lot. So I learned a lot of those dances too. And there was no piano in the house, but they didn't play any instruments, and my older brother also didn't play. So I demanded a piano, I remember that, and my parents at first, when I was 3 or 4, got me a toy piano. And we had a parakeet at the time that used to peck the keys apart. And I always think that by the time we got a real piano, we also had the parrot, which so the little parakeet and the little piano, and then a big piano and a big bird. So it sort of went together. He didn't pick the keys apart though. So I started playing at what made me want a piano was Leonard Bernstein on television, which was my generation was just so turned on by the Young People's Concerts, which is one of the reasons I've devoted myself to a similar thing, very much in my educational work. And the other was Victor Borge. I didn't know how funny it was till a little later, but when I was a little kid, I just thought he was wonderful. And I wanted to have a piano for that reason also. So first we got a little piano, and my first piano teacher when I was 6 told my parents I had no musical ability, no talent whatsoever. And they knew it wasn't true because I spent all my time at the piano and I could pick out melodies I heard on the radio and I could play by ear. But he and I didn't get along because we sat on the piano bench together. That was his idea. And he had been smoking lots of cigars. And I was 6. He smelled bad. So I didn't like him and I couldn't do anything next to him. And he didn't teach well either. So I just wanted to get away from him. And I guess my parents didn't realize that I didn't like him until he said that. And when they said to him, okay, I guess he won't study piano, they turned to me as soon as he left and said, don't worry, we'll find someone else. And I think I must have said, and somebody who doesn't smell.
So you started out as a pianist. At what point did composition enter the picture?
Well, I would say there's a difference between knowing what composition is and improvising, because I improvised before I had piano lessons. I was always fooling around at the piano and picking things out and trying things. And my first good piano teacher, Eleanor Nelson, somebody I still know, and a wonderful teacher, she didn't teach composition, but she did talk about the structure of a piece even when I was 7, and harmonies and what the chords are and how a piece is put together. And for her, that was just a natural way of discussing music intelligently, even with a child, rather than letting it all just be about fingers and rhythm and metronomes. And so I started writing my own pieces down, partly because the improvisations were no longer satisfying. But the first piece, it's coming to me actually, I just thought of it. The very first piece I wrote in order to be different from the other piano students that my teacher had, because there was a little musicale that she put together where all the 10-year-olds were supposed to play something by Bach and some other piece. And they were all playing pretty much the same pieces because they were all the same age and they were about the same level. So I had a Bach piece, a prelude, but I wrote something else. So in order not to play a piece that anybody could possibly know, I just wanted to have my own piece. So I wrote this piece, and she let me program it. And on the program that was handed out to the parents who came, it said Adolphe instead of saying Bruce Adolphe. It just said Adolphe. So when the applause came, My father pretended he wrote the piece for a second. He stood up and took a bow. And for a moment, I was shocked. But then the audience applauded him, and then he sat down and said, no, actually, my son wrote it. And then there was shock. And I remember the feeling that they actually thought he had written his son the piece, that in other words, it was believable that an adult had written the piece. I don't remember what the piece was like, but I do remember that reaction of, they thought my father wrote it. It just made me feel great. And that was the first moment of connecting with an audience with a piece that I'd written.
So as you started going more in the direction of composition, did you have in your mind a sense of a composer's role in the world today?
I had a lot of ideas about what a composer would be, and they were basically, I would put them into two categories. What I could see on media, which was, in those days, it was basically television or radio, and what I knew from the stories of great composers, because I had played a lot of Beethoven and Bach, and I also played Chopin, and I knew about them. I read books, and I knew who they were. I read biographies. And of course, the biographies were somewhat romanticized. I wasn't reading the same books you would read later. But I just felt that there was so much passion and so much excitement around who they were and what they did. And so that was exciting. And then what I got really, again, goes back to a certain extent to Leonard Bernstein, who was a composer and was speaking directly to the audience and speaking directly to kids. And I thought, look how accessible and fun and available this all is. So it must be possible to do that. And of course, he wrote West Side Story, which I think it came out when I was 3, but by the time I was 7, I saw it, and that was a huge thing to have some living composer write something that powerful that, as I said to my father when we saw West Side Story, that I wanted to be a hoodlum afterwards. But I was kidding. I wanted to not be a dancer or a singer or an actor. I wanted to be the guy who wrote that. And I have always felt that way. And I felt that way when another piece that influenced me very much was L'Histoire du Soldat of Stravinsky, The Story of a Soldier. I was crazy about that piece. And again, there was an actor, there were dancers, there were great musicians. And I only wanted to be the person who wrote it. And in fact, for a while, I thought I did write that. I think when I was 8 or 9, I thought I wrote some Stravinsky pieces because I took such ownership of them that if people mentioned them, I would say, how do you know about that piece?
So you studied at Juilliard. How did that education shape or diversify your musical activities now that you have so many at this point in your life?
Well, if you're talking about Juilliard, the college, I did a lot of studying at various places even before that. I studied at the Juilliard pre-college, and I also went to the Kinhaven Music School during the summer. And I'll get to the college, but the Kinhaven Music School was a profoundly amazing thing for me. It's in Vermont. In those days, it was 9 weeks during the summer. And it was founded by David Dushkin, who was probably in his 80s or early 90s when I went there. And his brother was Sam Dushkin, who premiered the Stravinsky Violin Concerto and was a close friend of Stravinsky's and a colleague of his. He also played the duo concerton with Stravinsky at the piano. So I knew this about David Dushkin fairly early on, that he was connected indirectly to Stravinsky, and I was so excited to be there. I was there to play the piano. This is as a young teenager, 14 and 15. In chamber music, play the bassoon and orchestra, but I let it be known that I was composing music, and at the time, Kinhaven didn't have a structured compositional program. But David Dushkin just said, well, we should play your music. Write parts out, and he, there were no computers, so we wrote things out by hand, and the students and the faculty would read through music for me and for other composers who were writing. We just had this amazing freedom, and there was no set schedule about this. So I would write a piece on Monday that's 10 minutes long, and on Tuesday we would get musicians together and play it, and it might be programmed on a concert on Saturday, and the whole feeling of that was just remarkable. And then the conductor of the orchestra, Jerry Bidlack, who is retiring from Kinhaven this year, so he's been there 50 years conducting. He came up to me and said, if you want to write something for orchestra, we'll play it. This was amazing for a 14-year-old to hear this. So I would write for a couple of weeks, short piece, and my friends helped me copy out all the parts, and then Jerry would conduct it, and then he let me conduct it. I had never conducted an orchestra, but he just gave me the baton and gave me 2 hours, and then we would perform it. So that, talk about formative experiences. That place in Vermont, Kinhaven, was just remarkable. The Juilliard Pre-College was a great experience in many ways. It's only once a week, not as intense, not living there. And I studied composition there and played bassoon in the orchestra, and that was a lot of fun and very, very good. And I taught there for many years after that. And I played in lots of youth orchestras, and those friendships, I mean, I played in youth orchestras when I was 13, 14, 15 with people I still know, people who are in the Emerson Quartet now, people who are in major symphonies. I mean, the connections formed as a young teenager, they're in the New York area with the serious musicians, they're still everywhere. I see these people every day. So, and when I say every day, I'm not even kidding. The Upper West Side, I mean, on the way over here, I see people that I've known most of my life because that's how music is. So when I finally got to Juilliard, I was pretty young. I left high school kind of on the early side. I graduated when I had just turned 16 in the May that I graduated, May, June. So I was 16 when I started at Juilliard. And I had a free-for-all there. I already knew all about this kind of place. I had been at the Juilliard Pre-College. I had been at music camps. And for me, it was a big music camp. And I had a great time. I studied with Milton Babbitt for a while and Vincent Persichetti for a while. And I got to know Elliott Carter very well and Roger Sessions very well. So there was a tremendous and serious compositional community and great kids everywhere, amazingly talented people everywhere. And making those friendships and giving them a piece to play and having them ask me, would you write me something for my recital, that just never stopped. But one of the things that happened at Juilliard that was not typical for music students was I found myself involved with the drama department deeply. And at the time, I'm not sure how it is now, but at the time, drama, dance, and music were just completely unrelated unless musicians were playing for the dancers, something like that. They didn't have any music or drama or dance classes. They never overlapped. You might have an English course with somebody, but that's it. So one of the directors, Harold Stone, he was a teacher and a director, was looking for someone to write some music for something he wanted to direct at Juilliard with the drama department. Somehow, he got to me because I think I had already written some music for La Mama experimental theater and had done things outside in the theater world. I was 19 though. And so maybe I was even 18. And so Harold found me and said, do you want to write some music, some songs for this show? We need someone to do it. So I did that, and I said, can I watch drama classes in exchange for this? He said, sure, anytime you want. So when I was at Juilliard, the drama students included Kevin Kline and Patti LuPone and David Ogden Stiers and Mary Lou Rosado and Robin Williams and Christopher Reeves and lots of people. And lots of other people that are also great, like Boyd Gaines and Suzanne Costalos and lots of other actors that I still know. So I watched these classes, and it changed my view of creativity profoundly, because musicians are studying primarily technical things all the time. How do you do this? How do you play this? How do you do it right? How do you do it well? And composers too, there's a lot of technical stuff. You have to know how to write for all the instruments. You have to balance things. You have to have sense of structure and form. You have to study counterpoint. You have to study historical aspects of composition. You have to study what's going on now. How do you use electronics, whatever. It's very technical oriented, and the assumption is that your inner life will emerge. And people might say something to you about your emotions, but the actors were studying emotions. That was their technique. Of course, they also studied speech and movement, but there's an aspect to reality, emotional memory. If an actor is not convincingly upset in a role where they're supposed to be upset or happy, it's not like a musician where there's a generality about the emotion, and the more specific it can be, the better. But nobody will say to a musician, well, maybe they will, but it's rare for someone to say to a musician, that sounded joyous and happy, but I don't believe you're feeling that way right now. They probably won't say that, you know. But if the audience feels that an actor isn't actually feeling something, they don't believe the character, and the whole thing's a disaster. So I was very turned on by this, and many years later I started a class for musicians in the Juilliard Pre-College like that addressed emotions, that addressed non-technical issues on a regular basis, and that became my book, The Mind's Ear, which eventually led to meeting Antonio. So there's a nice connection to it.
So speaking about the creative process compositionally, it seems to me that throughout music history, the best works were regarded as the ones that broke new ground. Is this a pressure that composers are aware of?
I think it's a slightly false idea, but it is extremely typical and common, and I think composers often think this way. But for example, Bach was completely original and unique, but he also looked back in time. He was not really breaking new ground in a way that people thought of then. He was considered old-fashioned, actually, because of his counterpoint, which was a Renaissance concept. We look to Bach as probably the greatest composer who ever lived, whose music reaches into every branch of music and inspires every kind of musician, classical musicians, jazz musicians, everybody. But Bach was really writing not to break new ground, but just to explore the art of music for its own intrinsic worth and value, to explore what he could do in it. What could a fugue be? Not to make a new fugue, but to make everything as perfect and beautiful in his, and of course in his mind, from a religious perspective, also to the glory of God. That's what he was about. Beethoven's different. Beethoven was always breaking new ground, and each piece was a new thought. And I think in his case, and Beethoven is the reason we think this way, in his case, there was always some extraordinary mental breakthrough, emotional breakthrough. Each piece was a discovery, and audiences reacted that way. People thought that he's changing the world with his music. He's still the composer we think of as the paradigm and the archetype of struggling, of tearing the paper out, of even what a composition is, almost to a fault, that you have to have an idea that's rhetorical, that's clear, then you follow it and develop it through, and you leave nothing, no stone unturned. All of that, the romantic part of it, the breaking new ground, the compositional technique, the romantic imagery, it's all from Beethoven. So I don't think everybody falls into that category.
Do you fall into that category?
No. However, it's a great question to ask about breaking new ground. I think what's really important is to be authentic to yourself. In other words, to be personally connected. Now, this idea of authenticity, this is nothing new with me. In fact, in the 19th century in France, there are many books about authenticity. Who is authentic, who is not? What is true in the arts, in painting, in music? And if you look at philosophy of creativity, you'll find that this is a huge subject. It's also true in acting. Are you feeling it, or are you just showing us what it's like? And are we supposed to feel it? I mean, and same with music. Is this really coming out of your inner life, or are you making notes fit together in beautiful ways? If a composer writes a great piece and they are doing it because of being inspired by love, fine. Or if they're being inspired by mathematics, and the piece is great, that's also fine. If they're inspired by some scientific idea, like I have been occasionally, that also can be great. There's no one way to do this. So the scientific idea is really more of an intellectual thing, but ironically we know from Damasio, there's no intellectual thing that isn't also emotional. So in the end, if you're inspired by the moon, or if you're inspired by a mathematical formula because you're really good at math and you're also a composer, or if you're inspired by a visual artwork and you're trying to do something with it musically, and you're not thinking emotionally so much as patterns and organization, it's still emotional because you love that painting somehow, or you're drawn to it in order to work because of how you feel. So there's no objectivity. The difference is, are you really passionately, at some level, engaged with the music you write, or has it become routine, or is it, has it become a habit? So I'm aware of, if I form habits, I'm aware of writing the same piece again, which I try not to do, although some people do that on purpose and they're fine with it, So I'm not going to tell people what to do, or even a student of mine, that there's a way to do this. But I think being in touch with, in a way, what's normally out of reach is important. In other words, being in touch with really deep emotion, really thoughts that you can't get out of your mind, or thoughts that you can't express except through music. Now, for example, I mean, if you're thinking of a human being and you want to write a piece for them, that's pretty concrete. But if you think about the qualities of that person, it becomes impossible to say what they are necessarily. I mean, if you're a poet, you will try. But I mean, if you wanted to write a piece, and I have actually been writing a lot of pieces about human rights recently, about justice. Justice has no color. Justice has no texture. Justice has no physical entity. It is already like music. So it's abstract, it has emotional qualities, it has rhythm, of things. So trying to get at what should be music, what should inspire music, is also an interesting endeavor.
You're talking about drawing from many different influences. Many of my composer friends frequently complain of writer's block. What do you tell them?
Luckily, I taught a lot, so I have a lot of feelings about writer's block.
Okay.
Your question earlier is a writer's block question, and you know that. Like,
yes.
Are you thinking that you have to break new ground? If you think that, you'll probably have writer's block. Writer's block comes from thinking about the task and what you're trying to achieve rather than the music. If you think you're trying to write a piece that's going to change the world, well, that's kind of hard to do. But also, if you think and I've actually met composers who say this, I'm going to write a prize-winning piece. That's a ridiculous thing to think, because there's no music in that. There's no quality of music. There's nothing about music in it at all. All it is the kinds of things that make it hard to proceed. Just like, let's say you're a runner and you run really, really, really fast, and then all of a sudden you're in a competition. That might be a problem for you because there are rules, there's timing, you're in a uniform, you have to creatively, as a creative person, not give yourself competition and rules and uniforms. So you have to be free. So it has to be at some level for yourself first, as a self-discovery. The other thing is to have a process that works. And I think part of the process has to start with a kind of dreaming. Now, that doesn't mean you're asleep. I mean attentive, wide-awake dreaming. So you might imagine, let's say you have to write a string quartet. If you sit down with paper or a computer and you're immediately trying to think of a string quartet, you're already giving yourself a hard time. It's better to lie down and imagine a string quartet coming on stage and you're in the audience and they start to play. What do they play? That's already more interesting. In other words, let your imagination free rather than constrict it by sitting down and having all the accoutrements of composition ready and just waiting for that idea. It's better to be aware most of the time and ready for an idea. I mean, everyone knows, somebody writes a theme on a napkin somewhere in a restaurant, or somebody starts singing in the forest. These cliches, they're true. Because if you're really free and your mind is open and you're ready to write music at any moment, you won't be blocked. Now, I think composer's block is usually a temporary situation that has to do with the restraints and fears and constraints that you put on yourself. And some people get a commission and it freezes them up. Other people, it opens them up. So you have to find out about yourself and allow yourself to dream and be free and open. Sounds easy, but I think it's a matter of not pressurizing yourself.
One of the ideas this show is very interested in is following the student's journey from graduation to success. Is it possible today for a young composer to survive financially through composition alone?
Composition alone. Well, if you write for movies, sure. There are ways to write. In other words, when you say composition, it has many subcategories. Writing pure music that is not for film, not for theater, and not for the biggest moneymaker, ringtones for cell phones, or television ads or something. If you want to write just pure music, it's difficult because you might have a year where you make a lot of money and then a year where you don't make any money. Like you might have a commission from a major orchestra or an opera company or something, and you get paid really well, and you have several years where it's great. And then you might get a few small commissions or nothing for a year. So it's like being an actor. I mean, what do you do about that? You might be in a movie and get paid really well, and the movie's a big hit, and then nobody hires you for a while because they know you as that character, and you need time for people to forget who you are. Or because in the music world you had such a huge hit that now they're spreading it around a little bit. So I would say it's probably rare and difficult, but it always has been. It's hard to think of a composer. Again, Beethoven's not a good example of anything. He's Beethoven. But it's very unusual to think of a composer who successfully only wrote music. Stravinsky is a good example. But very few. I mean, he did conduct too, and he also played the piano a little bit. I think if you rule out conducting and performing and even some teaching, it's difficult because it's too unpredictable. On the other hand, if you don't have a family and you're just supporting yourself, you could probably manage it. But I mean, I have a daughter and a wife and a parrot, and you know, it's a little bit too wild to do that. So I actually did not ever go about planning, would I only compose, what would I do? Things happened. Mm-hmm. Like my radio show, which has been on so long now, it's not something I ever expected to do.
Just like me on this show.
There you go. You know, serendipity, somebody offers you something and it turns out that instead of doing it once, you do it 100 times, or you do it for 15 years instead of 1 week. I have taught in lots of different places, but I'll tell you, I've done very strange things for a living that have nothing to do with music.
Really?
Yeah, just actually one. For 10 years, twice a week, at New York University Tisch School of the Arts, I was the drama school dialect coach. Not a lot of people know this. I haven't done it for a really long time. The last time I did it was 1993. But I would be working on before this happened, I would be working on an opera of mine, and I would talk this way or something, you know, I would talk with a certain dialect. Or I might be speaking in some other way to someone about some composer or something. And lots of musicians kid around with dialects. And somebody said, you know, they're looking for a dialect teacher at NYU. Why don't you go for the job? And I thought, you've got to be kidding. I'm just joking around. I don't know how to do that. But I needed money. So I went to Tim Monach, who was the Juilliard Drama School dialect teacher. And now he's been in Hollywood for a long time. And first I went to him, and we knew each other very well because I had written music at that point for quite a few plays, both for the drama school, and I had written for the public theater and for things John Houseman had done. And for 3 or 4 years, I wrote a lot of theater music. Center Stage in Baltimore, Harvard Loeb, you know, and Tim Monach was often there as the dialect person. I said, Tim, did you hear about this job? He said, yes. I said, do you want it? He said, no. And I said, do you think I could get the job? And he said, what? Do you do dialects? So I did a handful of dialects for him, and he said, these are pretty good. Can you do Irish? I said, I don't think so. He said, you need it. So he gave me a book, and he said, start by dropping down like this, and then you got to do certain things with the vowel sounds. And after a little while, I was doing an Irish dialect. He said, I think you could get a job. Go for it. So I started doing it. And I learned all these dialects, you know, maybe 25. It was still a problem because people wanted to learn dialects I didn't know. So I said, I'll help you learn it. Because, you know, if you know the International Phonetic Alphabet and you have a good ear, you can do it. So I did it twice a week for 10 years. So that's an example of, it wasn't even music. It was completely unpredictable.
You wrote a piece called, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Franz commentation.
You pronounced that very well.
How was this work constructed?
Okay, well, first, the title has in it Franz, from Franz Schubert. It has fragment is a word with the N and Z are in parentheses. So it's fragment and Franz, and then mentation as in thinking, and fragmentation. So it's Franzgementation. The title is by far the worst part of the piece. The rest of the music is much more comprehensible. I wrote the piece because the Brentano String Quartet, which is one of the great ensembles in the world, and I'm so fortunate to know them, but I also know them for a very, very long time. In fact, I presented their first concert in 1992 because Mark Steinberg, the first violinist, had been my student at Juilliard Pre-College, and when he was in a very unusual class. Alan Gilbert was in the class, and all kinds of great people who we know now. And I taught them like they deserved. Even though they were all in high school, I did very advanced theory and analysis with them, like you would do in a graduate school. And we did, among other things, study Gesualdo. And Mark, many years later, Mark started a string quartet called the Gesualdo Quartet, which later he dropped and called it the Brentano Quartet. And members kept changing until he found the ensemble that worked. And Mark is a very creative, imaginative musician with really out-of-the-box thoughts. And he has several times commissioned groups of composers to come together and write works. They don't actually write together, but the piece will be a composite of movements by different people that are all addressing a certain goal. And that has been done in the past, even in the 19th century. But in the case of this, he gave each of, I think, 6 composers a fragment. It was called the Fragment Project for their 30th anniversary, I believe. It was either that or their 20th, I'm not sure. But he gave each composer a fragment by a famous composer, an unfinished phrase. So I got Schubert, and Schubert had written a slow movement of a quartet that he never finished. He never finished the movement or the quartet. First movement is famous from this. And the idea was to react, not to write in Schubert's style, and not to continue the piece unless you wanted to, but it was to react to the unfinished music. So I actually learned a lot doing this because it was an interesting problem. It was almost like a homework assignment. And at first, since I write all these piano puzzlers, my first inclination was something I wasn't happy with, which was to take the tune that Schubert wrote at the beginning and put it in a different style. And I thought, I can put this in any style I want, but that's not a piece by me. So I got that out of my mind because I'm so used to taking, if I have a tune like that, to doing the puzzles. So I thought, well, I could harmonize it in very strange ways, but so could lots of people. So it was actually driving me crazy because I started the thing maybe 5 or 6 times, and each time, this is the opposite of composer's block. I had way too much music and I didn't like any of it. So it was like, it wasn't really a block. It was like, I couldn't control it. It was almost verbose and just not working. But then I thought, okay, what I need is that authenticity. I actually said this to myself because I had written a book chapter about the process of being true to your inner self and authenticity. I said, okay, why is this not working? Because I'm taking this melody by Schubert and I'm thinking like lots of composers would think, what do I feel? What is this connection to this tune? And I realized the tune now was like an earworm. I thought about it all the time and it was driving me crazy, like some pop song you can't get out of your head. And I thought, that's the problem and that's the solution. I should take the fact that it's sort of making me crazy, and that's what the piece should sound like. So I took the tune and I put it in 11/16, this rhythm, which is or you can mix up the 4s and the 3s, just so that it sounded like it was spinning in a way Schubert would never have, something like that. Whereas I think of it in Indian rhythms, takadimi, 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 takadimi. So that made it sound very un-Schubert, but also spinning in a circle. And then I let it start quietly and get more and more intense and start to just be almost painful and viscerally difficult. And then I would let it explode and go spinning. So basically I found an emotional and visceral way of dealing with the music that really came from my confrontation with it. And that's what the piece is.
Adolphe, thank you so much for being here and for your time. It was such a pleasure to have you here on Living the Classical Life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
It was fun.
Yes.